Okay, this evening we have the honor of having Pam Stitely, one of our own, give a lecture on the Operation Bernhard notes. Thank you.
Thank you. A few months ago, maybe some of you read in the paper, they've had some press, the television, newspapers, magazines. One of the famous forgers died, one of the last couple. And so it brought it all back, and there was a lot of press. And I had started collecting them last summer, so it wasn't really something that I had to read all about again. But I did a lot more research, and it's a fascinating piece of history. We go back to World War II. Right at the beginning, around 1939, when the Germans decided that they would try to completely ruin the British economy. And they were going to do this by making forgeries and pass them off. The initial goal to do this was to destabilize the whole economy by dropping tens of thousands of these notes from an airplane right onto the area of the main part of England. But it never worked out because I think most of the people felt they didn't have enough planes for that massive drop. But they were hoping that everyone would pick up the notes and spend them, and then it would cause rapid inflation and destabilize the economy. But the plan had also been discussed to use them all throughout the British Empire, and that was never completely done, but it was the main idea. The initial plan was called the Andreas operation, and this started in 1939, and the first thing that they had to do was to be able to make the paper, the ink, the engravings, everything just like the original English notes. Now, the Bank of England had printed notes from about 1855 that were about the same. They had made some changes over the years, but not many. And look at the size of the notes. So these notes were still being used. And so they decided this was the note they would copy, and they would use the dates from the 1930s because they were still in existence. Now, the Bank of England never suspected that anyone would be able to copy them because they kept ledgers of every group of serial numbers, and they made little changes in the notes that only they would know about. And every once in a while they would change a few more. So they were kind of smug about it and really felt that they didn't have to worry about anybody trying to counterfeit them. And the biggest thing was the watermark. The watermark is very fancy, and it covers almost the whole note. And afterwards, if you want to come up and look at this, it's amazing. So this Operation Andreas started it out. Now, this was run by military men and some scientists. They sent some of the original notes to technical colleges around England to determine what they were made of, what kind of fabric it was made. The rag paper, they knew it was rag paper, but they weren't sure what type of rags and what else was added to it. So once this was established, they knew that they were made with a certain type of linen or cotton rag. They knew what kind of rags they were, what the mixture was, and there was no cellulose added to it. So they made a piece of paper, and it was not an exact match. So then a couple of things they worked out. One was the, the feel of it was a little dull, and the color was a little dull under ultraviolet. So they figured that that was because the water used to manufacture the paper in England had a different chemical content. So they got samples of that from their spies, and they actually created a water that had the same chemical basis. And then they found out that it still wasn't exact. So they found out that the rags had been used in industrial factories. And so they put them into factories, had them used in all these local factories, had them cleaned, then they made the paper. Voila, paper was exact. Then, of course, they had to start in and figure out the ink. They had to do this very fancy watermark. They had to engrave the plates. And the biggest problem was how to decipher the mathematical system that the English used to create the serial numbers. So this went on, and by 1942, the higher-ups in the military decided this wasn't going to work because they weren't working hard enough. They didn't have that intuitive feel to get things right. It wasn't working, and the heads of it were in disfavor, which in Germany in those days wasn't a good thing. So Operation Andreas was dissolved, and it was taken over by Bernhard Kruger in 1942. Now, he had a whole different idea. He had been a textile engineer, so he knew all about cloth, he knew all about production. And then he was given, the paper had already been developed, so he had the paper. Then they had to make sure that the very fancy watermark worked, and then they had to have people to do the work. And this is what I consider an amazing thing in history. He started out with the concentration camp, Sachsenhausen. And he started there, and he found that there were some people there who did have some of the qualities and had used some of the tools that he needed. Then, this is something I didn't know, that when the Jewish people were put into these concentration camps, they had numbers put on their wrists. And the numbers recorded were in a list, and when you looked up things, you could tell who had these skills, all about their lives, all the history in their files could be looked at through these numbers. So then they went around to other camps, internment camps, and they found people with skills in engraving and in printing, ink making, all of it. They even had some that were clerks, but in that field. And so they brought them all together to that same concentration camp until there were 142 inmates. Now, they were kept in an area...
Do you want that picture up?
Oh, yeah, okay.
You gotta tell me.
All right, that's the entrance to the concentration camp. Now, the part they were kept in was a separate part. The other people who were there, having a horrible life, didn't even know they existed, because they had barbed wire keeping this part separate, and these people were fed well. They gave them good food. They allowed them to have musical entertainments. They played games with the guards. But when you think about it, behind that all was the feeling of, when they don't need us anymore, we'll die. So the final production group had divisions. There were divisions of engraving, printing, and then they had groups where men would stand in two lines and pass these notes back and forth, crease them, fold them, and just keep passing them back and forth until they looked like they had been used. Because everybody knows that you might distrust something that's brand spanking new, especially in the 5-pound notes. But one that is used, obviously, is a good one. And then they had people who would use pins to make holes in the corners. Because at that time, and in fact, maybe still, I know in France they did it even in the 70s, they pinned notes in the bank, groups of notes. Where we have paper around them, they pinned them with a big straight pin. So they would put the pins. Then they also would put names and addresses on them. Lots of people did that when they had the notes. And
Remember these stamped on them, the names they stamped on?
no, they wrote them.
Oh, okay, they wrote
Just like
them.
you would write a name on the,
Okay.
for something.
Sorry.
And then the tellers in the banks would sometimes make a pile of notes and write on the top one 105 notes or something. So they would write things like that on there too, just to make them look real. Now, no one knows just how many were created, but the estimates are somewhere between 8 and 9 million notes. A fortune. The finished notes were taken to laundering centers outside of the area, and the agents actually used them to import supplies for the army and to pay secret agents in the British Empire. Now, a lot of the agents that worked for this were told that these were notes that had been taken by the Germans when they took over other countries, and that they found the English notes in one of the banks, which wasn't true at all, but that's what they believed. And it's said that the famous spy Cicero was financed with these notes. Now remember, England was a vast empire and dealt with neutral countries all over the world. And so using these notes to buy things really, was a problem. But it financed all the spying activities. There was a story that after the war was over, one of the spies had kept all of his money in stacks, and he found out that it was not real. And so the Bank of England, by that time, after the war was over, knew about it and wouldn't give him the money for it. And so he sued the German government and said, hey, look, I took this money to be paid, but he didn't get it anyway. So back to the operation. As days went by, remember all this in their minds, that they might die when it was over. And people were beginning to feel that maybe there were some problems. The $5 note, near the end of the war, they had been told by one of the spies that it wasn't real. So people were beginning to distrust that. And people were concerned. So then they came up with the idea of switching to the U.S. currency. And they actually brought in a real counterfeiter to help them. And some people think that Kruger himself had fears that once this operation was finished, he would be moved to the Russian front. So it was in his interest to keep this going as long as he could to save himself. So they worked on it on the US $100 note. And they said they actually printed one side and did it really well. But no one is aware of any finished total notes that were ever made. Nobody's ever found them, at least I haven't heard of anything yet. So then we get to the, you want to bring? Yeah.
Yeah, just push it.
We'll get to some of the notes, okay. Now, what you can't see in here, of course, would be the watermarks.
See it on the next one.
Okay. Now, this is a 10-pound note, and they're amazing. If you look at the real thing, if it's used at all, it's very, very difficult to tell. Even if you know where to look, it's hard. And so this is a 10-pound. Next. Yeah. Now you can see in this one, you can see the watermark through it. And the watermark is where you can tell a few of the things. And I'll show you, there's some pictures here of a few of the areas where you can look. There's. You want to do another one?
Next one?
So they had a 20, and this is the 50. And the 50 I brought with me. Now, by the way, these were different sizes. The 5-pound note was different size than the others. So where you want to look, where's the first place you look for a mistake in a forgery, counterfeit? Anybody?